So first, a little bit of an introduction, who we are talking with this evening. Since 1997, David Henkin has been on the faculty at University of California, Berkeley, where he teaches mostly about society and culture in 19th century America. His previous books include City Reading, 1998, The Postal Age, 2006, and with Rebecca McLennan, Becoming America, 2014 and 2021. He is an active participant in San Francisco's Mission Minion community, which he co-founded in 2003, and which is also where I had the great pleasure of meeting him when I was living out there. And David Henkin also says the Psalm of the Weekday religiously. So you'll have to tell us if you started doing that before or after researching your book. We're going to do this kind of like interview style. So I'll start with my first question, and actually I'll let everyone who's here know that there also will be opportunity for you to ask questions. We know most of you have not yet had the opportunity to read the book, but you'll hear a little bit about the book this evening, and feel free to ask questions at the end when we get to that. So tell us a little bit about your new book, David.
Thanks, Julie, and hi, everyone. I'm holding this book in my hand mostly because it's just astonishing to me that so many years of my life is represented in an object that I can fondle. But this book emerged from a long-standing curiosity about this strange calendar unit that we call the week. As many of you probably know, the week is really the only completely artificial time unit that we live by. It's not a multiple or an even fraction of any other time unit except for the day, and it's not really suggested by, let alone marked by, anything in the observable universe. So that's a sort of strange thing. And I've always been curious about it and all the different things that the week does. And I'm especially interested in the different things that we do with our week. So this book argues that the modern experience of the week appeared first in the United States really in the early 1800s, and wasn't so much about the use of the week for religion or even for labor, but was really about the use of the week to coordinate the schedules of strangers. Something that I imagine all of us on this call do. We rely on the 7-day cycle to make appointments with other people, to remember them, and to stagger the various things in our lives by the day of the week. It seems like a small thing, but to me, I suspected, and think my research confirms, was actually a very big thing that was really at the heart of why people remembered what day of the week it was, why they cared, not just if it was the weekend or the weekday, but why they cared if it was Tuesday or Wednesday. And then, of course, why it's so disorienting to think that it's one day and discover that it's another. So this is an attempt to explore a topic in the history of ordinary people's lives in the United States, which is one of the things I do for a living. But it's also an attempt to unravel the mystery of why it is that the week exerts such a powerful grip on our consciousness and our sense of being in time.
Thank you. So you said that the week is not based on anything natural. Not even remotely, not based on anything in the natural world?
There are people who have suggested otherwise. Most commonly, people have suggested that the week is essentially a lunar timekeeping device, right? Because lunation, they say, is about 28 days long, then people began to care whether we were in a waxing or a waning phase, and wanted to know whether we were over half a moon or less than half a moon. That strikes me as pretty unlikely, in part because a lunation is not 28 days long. It's actually closer to 30. It's a little over 29. So it could as easily have suggested that people create cycles of 5 or 6 days, which people have. People have also wondered whether maybe it had to do with rates of food spoilage, and people would have cycles of markets every 7, but that obviously varies with the latitude and climate. People have suggested that it might have to do with menstruation, but it doesn't seem so likely that people would want to divide up quarter cycles based on a 28-day menstrual period. Plus the fact that, as we know, it's a very rare person who has a menstrual cycle that is so rigidly attached to 28 days, it would make sense to count quarters of it. But the best reason to be skeptical, well, let me mention one more. Scientists have actually discovered that there are some organisms that have certain bodily rhythms that they call circumception, right? Which means roughly every 7 days. But we only discovered those biological processes in a very few species with complex computational procedures that were not available to us. It's the idea that human beings mimicked the obscure, roughly 7-day cycles of other species seems crazily unlikely to me. And then finally, I think the best reason not to go looking too hard for natural roots of the 7-day cycle is the fact that for most of human history, many societies did perfectly well without them. And it's only really in the last 100 years or so that the 7-day cycle has taken firm root in societies like Japan. It's only been a few hundred years that it's taken root in other parts of Asia and East Africa. It's really only in the last 500 years that it's had any foothold in the Americas, and other societies have had cycles of different lengths. So unlike the month, there's really no reason to sort of I think suspect that ultimately this is a natural rhythm.
So would you say that the 7-day week was originally a Jewish idea?
I would. I mean, there is some limited evidence that that other societies had what we might call weekly taboos that would be comparable to the Sabbath from a similar period, but that evidence is pretty limited. There's also a separate tradition of 7-day week counting that's based on the planets, but I think the best evidence suggests that that is less old than the Jewish week. So I mean, I'm not too attached to the idea that the Jews came first. But the Jews do seem to be the originators of a 7-day cycle of work and rest. So if that's what you mean by a week, then yeah, I'd say give credit to the Jews.
And where do you think that idea came from?
That's a hard thing. I mean, the traditional answer would be that this is sort of either built into the natural universe through God's creation, or that it was passed down through God's law. Interestingly, if you look at the Bible, you had to go pretty deep into the Bible to get to a point where people seem to be living by the week or keeping Shabbat. And it was not really used as a dating system, hardly at all, in any traditional Jewish sources until maybe the 2nd century BCE. So I don't really know what produced it in the first place. Yeah, I mean, people have speculations about the human body wanting to rest a certain amount of time. I'm gonna plead agnosticism as to what actually contributed to the invention of the week, other than to say that Jewish legal practices seem to lie at its origin.
That's fair. Your focus is 19th century America, so we won't hold you to speculate about the origins of the 7-day cycle in the Bible. But can you tell us about some other ways that societies have counted the week, like different numbers of days in a week?
Yeah, there have been weekly. I mean, if you define a week as any recurring cycle bigger than a day, smaller than a month, I'd say we have lots of examples of 5-day counts, 8-day counts, 10-day counts. The Mayans did 20-day counts for some purposes, and that's, I think, one interesting and well-known calendar system. They cared a lot about the number 20, much less about the number 7. There have been lots of 5-day market cycles in West Africa and other places. Maybe the best known 8-day week was in ancient Rome. The Romans had both an 8-day and a 7-day week at the same time. So there's no reason why a week has to be 7 days. And there are societies that I think had no regularly recurring cycle of days smaller than a month.
How did Rome do a 7-day and an 8-day cycle at the same time?
Well, I mean, one could ask, and it's an interesting question, how can we do a 7-day cycle and then a 31-day cycle? You count one for one purpose and one for another. The 8-day cycles were really part of a month. Oddly, the 7-day cycles were not. The 7-day cycles were planetary cycles, where each day was understood to be under the dominion of one of the 7 celestial bodies, the 7 planets, counting the sun and the moon, that you can see from Earth. But nothing in Roman civil life or economic life revolved around that cycle. So you could have a cycle for a different purpose. Much as we have, so some of us have pay periods where we think of, okay, this half the month or every 2 weeks. That aren't the same as the other cycles that we live by. What I think drives Julie's question is that we're so attached to the 7-day week, we can't imagine there being another overlapping or recurring cycle, because the 7-day week is really, really important to us. It just wasn't that important in ancient Rome, so it could have other calendars going on at the same time.
Wow. So today is Thursday, and I think probably everyone on this call would agree that today is Thursday, unless you're somewhere across the globe, in which case it might be Friday. But we're all in agreement about what day of the week it is. Have there been societies in which people disagreed about where they were in the week or what day it was?
This is one to me. Monday, to me, it's so fascinating to me. I think the answer is no. And that's a crazy thing, because there's nothing in the observable world that can tell us whether we've gotten off track. Maybe that's partly why we don't disagree, because it's an unresolvable disagreement. But no, I mean, societies certainly disagree about the significance of each day of the week. But we are all what you might call in phase, right? One society never says to the other, no, you're wrong about the count. But the only thing that secures the count is record keeping and history. Right? To say that today is Thursday, not Wednesday, is to make a claim about the past, and that's all. Right? That's something that you would think we would disagree about, but we don't. I'll give you one example. In Jewish history, there have been sectarian disputes about the calendar throughout, and especially in the early centuries CE, disputes about what day of the month it was. So Karaite Jews and Rabbinite Jews disagree about what date today is in the month of Kislev, even though that's supposedly a natural calendar. But they never disagreed about whether it was Wednesday or Thursday. Jews and Christians never disagreed about whether they might call it different things, but whether it was Wednesday or Thursday. The only real uncertainty about the week has to do with the international date line. So for example, when the United States acquired Alaska from Russia in the 1860s, this is before standardization of that date line, people living in certain parts of Western Alaska had the day change on them. Right? But not because people disagreed as to where we were in the week, they just disagreed as to where a place was on the daily calendar, which is an interesting thing. The other thing, when the Gregorian calendar was introduced, it eliminated all kinds of dates from the year, but it did not disrupt the weekly calendar. Pretty much nothing has disrupted, and attempts to stamp out the week, say in the French Revolution or in the Russian Revolution, replace it with something else, have failed as well. The week is a mysteriously resilient calendar unit that has secured broad agreement wherever it's been observed, and at this point really is a global institution. There isn't any part of the world that sort of stands out from weekly timekeeping.
Wow, that's kind of amazing. What are some assumptions that people may have about the week that you debunk in your book? And maybe some assumptions that we don't even realize that we have, like when I said, how can you have an 8-day week and a 7-day week?
Right.
So can you talk about
well, I mean, I think the most common assumption that some people have that I'm debunking, the book isn't really devoted to proving it, is the idea that it somehow is natural. So that's one thing. Other common misconceptions might be that it was more universal in the last couple hundred years than it actually was. But the most common misconception, I don't know if I debunk it exactly, but I resist it, is that all the week really does is divide work days from leisure days, or sacred days from profane days. And that's the essence of what a week does. That is probably, I think, the most important thing that weeks have done in their history, but it's not the only thing that weeks do, and it's probably not the reason why we care so much whether today is Thursday or Wednesday. Weeks do other things, and I explore that in the book, and I do make the argument that the modern week is really distinguished by its importance as a scheduling device.
Why do you focus on 19th century America in the book?
I mean, the truth is that that's the period of history that I know best, and I never would have come to have the kind of confidence that this might be an important phenomenon had I not been exposed to it in years of research. But in the end, the justification for focusing on it is because I do think that is when ordinary people began to have the kind of attachment to weekly calendars that we all have on this call. That before that period, most people living in North America knew and cared whether it was Sunday, but they didn't really have the attachment to the weekly calendar that we have. It matters much more whether it's Wednesday or Thursday than whether it's the 18th or 19th of the month. I'll share an interesting anecdote. Just I was in Japan not too long ago, and I asked someone, if someone made an appointment with you and they said, we are to meet on this day and this date, and the days and dates didn't align. In other words, someone said, I'll meet you on Wednesday, November 18th, and Wednesday wasn't November 18th. Which would you assume was correct? And which would you assume was the error? And without missing a beat, she said, oh, I would assume the date is correct and the day is an error. And I would be very surprised if anyone on this call would say that. If someone tells you we're going to meet on Tuesday and they give you a date that isn't on Tuesday, you still think it's Tuesday because you think it's unlikely they would have made that mistake, but totally likely that they might just confuse the dates, because the dates tend not to really matter. I mean, if you get paid on that date, if it's the date you're supposed to deliver a baby, if it's your mom's birthday, of course, there are dates that you really, really want to remember. But the rhythm of the month is not so internalized in our sense of the passage of time, and our appointment schedules are not so typically attached to the dates that that's a confusing thing. But if you have been thinking that today was Wednesday all day and just now you're discovering it's Thursday, my guess is not only have you missed some appointments, but also that discovery is unsettling. And that discovery somehow makes you feel like, oh, I've been laboring under a big misconception, even though there's nothing natural about the fact that today is Thursday. There's nothing real in some ways, but in other ways, it's totally real. Right? Today's Thursdayness was real for, I'm guessing, for most people on this call for a variety of reasons that don't have to do with either religion or with the weekday-weekend divide.
Yeah, just as a follow-up to that, well, first of all, do you know what day of the week you were born?
I do, but most people don't. I was born on Tuesday. Not only do most people don't know what day of the week they're born. You can go look it up now, or you can tell us in the chat if you happen to know. But most professional historians don't know what day of the week the Declaration of Independence was signed, or they don't know what day of the week Columbus disembarked in Hispaniola, or what day of the week the state of Israel was created. I mean, these don't seem like relevant things, but the date does. And that's an interesting thing. We actually remember, especially in the short term and in the current moment, the day rather than the date. But the day of the week doesn't seem like as useful a mnemonic device for securing a historic event. We have Jerry Friedman born on Saturday. All right. Julie, do you know what the day of the week you were born? You probably
I don't, but
really?
Right after this is over, I'm going to look it up. It's interesting. I think especially in the early months of the pandemic, a lot of people talked about how one day was merging into the next, and they didn't know what day of the week it was, right? And how disorienting that was. But why is it so disorienting? Is it just that our schedules are based on it?
and it's an interesting phenomenon because the quick explanation everyone gave as to why we were disoriented was that the shutdown had us working at home. But the shutdown having us work at home ought not to have produced that effect. First of all, it should have made us much more concerned about time of day than day of the week. And secondly, in theory, it could have made us as concerned about the date rather than the weekday, especially since so many of the things that struck us as like real deprivations during the shutdown had to do with the Gregorian calendar, not the weekday calendar. Things like, Zoom birthday party, or, a Thanksgiving dinner that you can't do, or a prom, or whatever. So but instead, whenever people complained about temporal disorientation in public media, it was always about the day of the week. And I think it's for a couple reasons. One is that's actually just the calendar we're most attached to. So if we get unmoored from all of our calendars, we're still going to complain about the one that feels closest to us. And the other reason, just more specifically, is I think we have a lot more weekly rhythms to our habits and activities. And so our Wednesdays come to have a particular kind of feel. Whether it has to do with custody arrangements, or whether it has to do with violin lessons, or whether it has to do with I don't know, some other communal activity. So we don't really notice that ordinarily, but when we start experiencing those activities differently, because they're on Zoom or because they're suspended or whatever, it shakes our sense of Wednesdayness, and that's a more disturbing thing than most people are aware of. But I guess to me that was actually not so surprising, because I spent the last 12 years thinking about, what does Wednesdayness look like and feel like? So the fact that my Wednesdays looked and felt differently during the pandemic shutdown, I think I was a little better prepared for.
What was one of the most surprising things that you discovered in the last 12 years of your research?
It's not that exciting, but a couple surprises. One was that food played a much smaller role in the 19th century in differentiating people's days than like many of you, I imagine, we grew up in food cultures, especially school food cultures that tracked the week. You'd have a certain item of food at the cafeteria or even at home, on the day of the week, and it spreads into commercial culture as well. Taco Tuesdays or things like that. So I expected there to be a whole lot of that, and there wasn't. I'll give you one more small surprise. I discovered that the most popular day to get married in antebellum US was Thursday. And that Sunday was neither the most nor least common day to get married. Right? again, neither of these really affected the argument of my book, but those were two things that I wasn't expecting to find and did.
Why is counting time in 7-day cycles useful or appealing, or is it?
I don't know. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately since the book is about to come out and people have asked that question. I think we're very poorly positioned to answer it because the week has so conditioned us to think that certain things ought to recur at intervals that it's tempting to say, well, yeah, I mean, you wouldn't want to see like a certain kind of entertainment more than once a week, or you wouldn't want to call your mom more than once a week. But apart from that, all those things are sort of in some ways highly debatable. If we do feel that way, it's surely because we have been living by the week. I mean, a 7-day cycle as opposed to a 6 or 8 day cycle might actually help us stagger or coordinate or sequester activities in our sort of reasonable human rhythm. But it doesn't have to. I mean, and one way we can see that is the transformation over the course of the 19th century toward and then into the beginning of the 20th century, more and more people not working on Saturdays. I think exposed the fact that there wasn't anything really natural about taking off 1 day out of 7. Now taking off 2 days out of 7 seems natural to us. And if I can veer a little bit into politics here, I would think that we would very happily come to conclude that taking off 3 or 4 days out of 7 might seem quite natural too. And I don't just mean that it would be beneficial, that's for sure, but also that it might come to seem natural. So I'm generally suspicious of explanations that say that the 7-day week naturally suits any of the social purposes that we put it to. Again, in part because it really isn't a natural calendar, and in part because many of the most powerful, gripping disciplinary forces in our lives are not actually natural.
Right, and you do have an attachment, personal attachment to the 7-day week, and we heard that you started the Mission Minion and are an active member. Can you share a little bit about your Shabbat practice, or in what way that informs your relationship to the week?
I will, but I'm distracted by one question in the chat that I can't resist answering. Laura asked whether Jewish marriages weren't on Thursday. Jewish marriages are most likely to be on Tuesday. And that's because of a tradition having to do with the biblical narrative where God twice says that creation was good on that day. So just the Thursday thing is not about Jews. It's about Gentiles, which gets me back to your question, Julie. In some ways, this project originally was motivated by a desire to figure out why it is that people who don't have my religious practices are as attached to the week as they are. Because I get why mine always have been. I grew up in an Orthodox household. It's not just that Shabbat structured time in a very powerful way. It's that every day of the week was different for liturgical reasons. I had to know whether the psalm of the weekday was a long one or a short one, whether we were going to be reading Torah at school and things like that. So I got why I cared about the week. But what anchored the week for everybody else? I'm sometimes fond of retelling the story that when I was very little, my older brother saw the babysitter running around the apartment switching the clocks as we were about to advance them in spring. And he turned to her and said, "Do non-Jewish people do this too?" And in a way, it's sort of surprising that he even thought that they might. That why it is that non-Jewish people are so attached to a week that for me was fully organized around Jewish observance was in some ways the childish curiosity with which this book originated. But yes, I am a person of the week for many reasons, and one of them, as Julie, as you say, is because I continue to live by a Jewish calendar that is very week oriented. I think it is a common misconception. This is not what the book's about, but just to talk about Jewish stuff for a moment. I think there's some common misconception that the Jewish calendar is a deeply natural calendar because it's attached to the moon, and obviously in many ways it is, but the Jewish weekly calendar is at least as prominent, and when it comes down to it, the Jewish weekly calendar governs the Jewish annual calendar, a monthly calendar. When the new moons fall in a way that's inconvenient for the observance of Rosh Hashanah, the year actually gets moved or delayed or preemptively begun. That really, if there's a battle between the calendars in Jewish law, the week does tend to prevail. And the fact that I'm a part of the people of the week is probably as significant as the fact that I'm part of the people of the book.
So you already had this relationship to the week and lived the week much, your whole life. Did anything shift after researching and writing this book in terms of your experience of it or relationship to it?
I would say no. Actually, I think that and in this sense, I'm a little bit resonating with what Lisa is writing in the chat. I think that both my Jewish observances and also just my being a kind of creature of habit more generally was pretty firm before I wrote this book, and probably motivated the book. The research of the book didn't really change it. It mostly just changed how I thought about other people's lives. I think, again, my life was pretty weak cemented or something long before.
Weak, W-E-E-K.
Correct. Strong cement of the W-E-E-K. Yeah. In some point in the book, I do refer to myself as a weakling, but I spell it with two E's.
So I just have one more question, and then we'll have the opportunity for everyone else to ask theirs, whether in the chat or if you want to be unmuted, you can use the raise hand function. So my last question is, are we, for better or for worse, stuck as a society with the 7-day week? Do you think this is now a permanent feature, or might we go back to, I guess we never really did this, but some societies did. Would we maybe shift to a 5-day week or an 8-day week or some other version of counting time, or do you think this is it?
I think it's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer. I'll just share a couple thoughts. First of all, to be clear, we're not talking about whether we could have a shorter or longer work week. That would be easy, right? I mean, or at least the obstacles would have to do with corporate capitalism. They wouldn't have to do with like deep structures of our mind. But the question is, could we stop counting cycles of 7 days? I'm a little bit skeptical. Oops, sorry. Am I still here? Yeah.
Yeah, you're still here.
Okay. I went into this research knowing that there is some reason to think that the week is unraveling. Primarily, the fact that people work from home and consume entertainment asynchronously. In other words, when I was a kid, we all cared whether it was Wednesday or Thursday because that's when our TV shows would be, and now we watch the TV shows on our time. So there were lots of reasons to think maybe the week was unraveling, and I think I was interested in the possibility that it might be attenuating. I never really thought it was going to be unraveling. But when I sort of looked back on this question at the end of writing the book, it seemed to me that the lessons of the last 200 years are that the week is remarkably easy to spread and remarkably difficult to extirpate, right? Even a small thing like in the early 20th century, there was a massive reform movement designed to change the calendar. It was going to keep the week at 7 days, but it was going to introduce some blank days at the end of the year so that you could have a 364-day calendar. And if you have a 364-day calendar, every November 18th can be the same day of the week. It'll simplify so many things. There were other reforms designed as well to simplify accounting, but they all had in common was they were designed to make the week conform to years, or to years and months. That wasn't even going to change the periodicity. It wasn't even going to make the week longer or shorter. It was just to say there'll be a couple days a year that have no weekday value. So you could go, for example, from Saturday, December 31st to blank day, December 32nd or whatever. And then you go to January 1st and there would be a Sunday. And even that failed. It failed despite huge, powerful support from business interests in the United States. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union tried to tinker with the 7-day week and with the power of a very big centralized state, and that failed too. The French Revolution failed. So changes in the week are really, really hard to accomplish. Changes in sort of the length or the sort of the cyclical regularity are really, really hard to achieve. And now, in the last 150 years, the week has gone to places where it didn't used to exist. So it's hard to conclude from the history of the week that anything that is happening right now, even I think important things like asynchronous entertainment and telecommuting and also people working on or socializing with folks for whom it is a different day. What you said before, Julie, I think is significant. 100 years ago, it didn't really matter to us whether people in Australia, it was Friday for them, because by the time we really had any meaningful contact with them, it would be a different day anyway. But now, we talk to them on the phone, we coordinate schedules with them. We can't say to them, I'll see you on Tuesday, because that's not actually a shared day. So there are a lot of reasons to think that the week will be experienced differently, but the unraveling or the altering of the week, I think, is a most unlikely prospect.
A couple of questions from Jane and Jeff. I'll read them out loud for the sake of the recording too. A couple of questions. Do you know the year? And another one came in. Sorry. There it is. Do you know the year that day timers went public? What do you see as the relationship between the 7-day week and the separation of church and state? Could you please comment on how the 7-day week has created unnatural rhythms?
Okay, let me take those in reverse order. When I say unnatural, I don't necessarily mean that they are bad for us. That I'm agnostic on that question. I'm like that they fit us poorly. I don't know. They might or they might not. They're just not based in nature. So that if we do something every 7 days or twice every 7 days, that creates a rhythm that I think feels natural, but for what it's worth is not actually mimicked in nature or dictated by it. So many of our other rhythms do have to do with the sun and the moon and our bodily clocks. The week doesn't. I don't have an answer to what's the significance of that, but to me, it's quite an interesting fact that we have become much more attuned to a rhythm that is not dictated by nature. The separation of church and state is a big question in the history of one part of this story, a part of the story that is told well in other books, and that is the regulation of Sunday activity. Right? That's lots of controversies about should the mail operate on Sunday? Should businesses be allowed to open on Sunday? Should municipalities be able to regulate people's movements on Sunday? And I say this was a very lively question in the United States in the period that I'm writing about and continued to be for a while. I don't think it really is now in the US. I think that that our consumer culture has created effectively a 24/7 commercial calendar. and the United States government and states governments have not tried to interfere with that, so it hasn't led to those those fights. But to the extent that there's a church and state issue, it was really, I think, specifically about what can be done on Sundays. Can you drink on Sundays? Can you play baseball? And that's an interesting story. But my book is really, in many ways, trying to show how much work the week did for people, not just on Sundays, but on every day of the week. But if you're interested in the history of debates about proper observance of the Sabbath in the United States, there are lots of books I can recommend. Probably the best would be Alexis McCrossan, Holy Day Holiday, which someone could type in the chat or link to. Okay, that was number 2. I need help with this, the daytimers went public question. Can you tell me what you have in mind?
Who is this? This was Jane.
This was Jane and Jeff. Or maybe Julie can help me.
Yeah, it was the Jeff part of Jane. I'm just curious, daytimers are such a ubiquitous part of our lives. We pick them up once a year, and I was just curious, David, with the amount of study that you've done, when the first daytimer or the week timer might have become a consumer offering. At what point? Is it early 1900s? Was it happening in the 1800s?
I'm pleading ignorance. Yeah, I'm actually not sure what you mean by a daytimer.
Oh, something that has the days of the week in it that you make notes on for planning.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
It's gone electric now.
Yeah.
So
yeah. They weren't called that. So that's sorry.
It's a baby boomer hangover. Sorry.
I'm revealing maybe my age or maybe just the fact that I'm an antiquarian. Yeah. So that is actually a big part of the story. I would call them pre-formatted diaries. So in the colonial period, the principal object that people used to track time was the almanac, and the almanac was organized around the month. And to the extent that it let you write into it to tell you like you had appointments, it was in the blank pages that would be between months. In the late 18th century, someone introduced a sort of pre-formatted pocket diary that people could use to write down what they had to do every day, and it bombed. Right? But around the 1820s, 1830s, it became hugely popular, and suddenly everyone had them. And if you, like me, spend your time in old historical societies and archives, they're everywhere. Some of them are blank, and people just use them just to look up what day was. But usually, if they're saved, it's because someone wrote in them. So those became popular consumer items around the 1820s and 1830s, and really proliferated, I'd say, maybe in the 1840s and 50s. So that's part of the story. Here was an object that people used to track time, and the thing about them. I have basically an equivalent of one now, is that they typically privilege the week rather than the month because they tended to show 6 or 7 days in a spread. So when you looked at your calendar, you weren't looking at a day the way we often are now on our electronic calendars, and you weren't looking at a month the way you were if you were looking at an old almanac. You were instead of looking at something that was roughly a week, and you were thinking about what's happening to me this week. So all those questions that I think we still instinctively ask: what's our week going to look like? What did we get done this week? What did we fail to do this week? All that that has deeper roots. I think it has some religious roots as well. Was in part conditioned by having this object, so that when you actually were taking stock of your life, you were thinking about weekly increments. So that's another reason why people think that the week might be losing its grip, is because we don't. I mean, I'm a weirdo. I write down my appointments in a book like this, but most of you don't. Most of you write down your don't write down your appointments at all. You either enter them electronically in a digital calendar, or they're even entered for you through someone else's invitation. And so that does reduce the significance of the week as a mnemonic device. So again, I think there are lots of reasons to think that stuff is changing in the last 20, 30 years that might make weeks different. I just don't think that that's going to lead to the unraveling or the alteration of the cycle.
Bimaya has a question, and then there are a couple of questions in the chat box.
Well,
Thank you.
sorry, but Maya asks whether, other than God's design of working 6 days and resting the seventh, there's no evidence that days matter. Well, I mean, I don't even think that God working 6 days and resting on the seventh necessarily even suggests a Sabbath. There's actually nothing in the Genesis narrative that says, oh, and therefore people will rest on the seventh day every 7 days. It could as easily have led to, and therefore we will rest on the seventh day of the year, or the seventh day of the month, or at any point when we've worked 6 days in a row. So even that doesn't naturally suggest a 7 day cycle. So I mean, again, this is not my like religious judgment about the significance of God creating the world in 6 days. This is me saying that I don't think the fact, if you take it to be that, of God creating the world in 6 days necessarily suggests or produces a 7 day calendar.
Okay, because that was actually my next question, because I'm a convert, and so not born into a Jewish family. I never understood like why I would read biblically, where to observe a Sabbath, which comes later, like you said, like in Exodus. But as God is creating and rests on the seventh day, then the calendar is like backwards, because we did it on Sunday, when every single calendar I've ever seen always lists Sunday as the first day of the week and Saturday is the seventh. So
Okay,
I
so
never, yeah, that makes
there are
sense.
so many interesting things in Maya's comment. Let me just try to first of all call your attention to the fact that she's 100% right. It's really the Exodus narrative, both the first giving of what we call the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, whatever, that makes the connection, but also in Exodus when Moses instructs the people to not collect the manna on the seventh day. That's really the origin, I would say, of the Sabbath in the Bible. But the other thing, but Maya's pointing out, is that we think of Sunday as the first day. So what is it that other people are doing? In many parts of the historically Christian world, Monday is actually the first day of the week on the calendar. If you look at a calendar in many parts of Europe and South America, it will actually begin on Monday. It even does so in Greece and Portugal, despite the fact that the names in Greek and Portuguese for the days of the week assume our count. By our, I mean Sunday, day one. The United States is pretty distinctive in conventionally treating Sunday as the first day of the week. Now, the question as to why Christians moved the Sabbath from what they called the seventh day of the week to what they called the first day of the week is interesting and beyond our scope. But just know that already in the period I studied, by law, the United States understood the first day of the week to be Sunday, and that is not actually so common in.
So then I guess my other quick question was that, like, in other countries, calendars are actually printed with another day of the week that's the first, not Sunday. And what does it look like in Israel?
Yeah, I bet someone here has lived in a country where you put the calendar on, you get a wall calendar, and Monday comes first. It creates the problem, if it's an English language calendar, if you're saying Great Britain, of having the two S's next to each other instead of separated as ours does. But that's not the reason that we do it. Again, if anyone wants to email me afterwards, I can go on at great length about why it is that the United States came to count the first day. But someone asked in the chat about the names of the days of the week. So maybe that's a question that people are wondering about. That is an artifact of the Roman planetary week. The Roman planetary week attributed dominion to each day of a 7-day cycle to one of the observable planets or to the eponymous god, the god who shares a name with the planet and is associated with it. So in most Indo-European languages, but not Portuguese, for example, but most of the Indo-European languages, the days of the week are named for those gods or planets. Sunday for the sun, Monday for the moon, Tuesday for Mars, Wednesday for Mercury, today is Jupiter's day, tomorrow is Venus's day, and Saturday is Saturn's day. And that's the explanation for it. In some languages, the Sunday or some Sunday and Saturday get replaced by a Christian name. So Domingo, Lord's Day for Sunday in Spanish, for example, or some languages have that, and then also have Sabbath for Saturday. But in English, they're pretty consistent. They are all planetary names.
Audrey had a question in the chat previously. Is it possible that the writers of the Bible plugged creation into the 7-day cycle because the world was so used to that breakdown?
That is the common assumption, that the Genesis narrative is justifying a pre-existing practice, and that may be, but remarkably, we have very little evidence of that practice other than the Bible. And the other thing is that pre-existing practice probably wasn't a calendar that people really lived by. It could just have been some kind of taboo against moving or doing certain kinds of labor on a certain day. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were counting. Marinaz asked about the Muslim week, and that's a very complicated subject. I think might take us too long. But Friday isn't exactly a day off in Muslim calendar. It's a climactic day of prayer. But it was not necessarily a day off from work, except to the extent people took more time off from work to engage in longer prayers. So the transition in Muslim countries to first under European colonization, now sort of under global capitalism, to demands that Sunday be treated as a special day, have not actually been as difficult to adjust to as, say, in Israel, where Saturday really is a day off, and not just a climactic day of prayer. So we call today Thor's Day because Thor is the god of Jupiter.
So maybe one or two more questions, because I know we're nearing time here. Lisa had asked, is there a relationship between the solidification of the week in people's lives and the standardization of clock time?
This is a great question. The very short answer is no. But the reason why it's a great question is because that's exactly what you would expect. Most histories of time, and certainly most histories of time in the 19th century, assume that the big changes have to do either with chronometry, advances in the precise measuring of time, or in the speeding up of life through steam railroads or electromagnetic telegraphs. And that is, in fact, a very good explanation for why we have things like universal time zones, or a standardized a dateline, or synchronized clocks. All those things are about that in the 19th century. It didn't really change the week, right? Because the week hasn't gotten any more precisely measured, except in really marginal ways that don't really matter. The fact that Wednesday becomes Thursday at a more agreed upon instant is not actually significant to our experience of Wednesday and Thursday. It's a really old technology. So part of the reason that I am interested in this topic, and part of what I do for a living, is I like to write books and teach classes about really unspectacular technologies that have been around for a long, long time, that are not about new inventions or the application of new machinery, but instead are about the application of very old techniques to new social conditions, or the adaptation to new social conditions of very old techniques. The week is really, really old, right? Nothing changes about it in the 19th century, formally, mechanically, scientifically, and yet I'm arguing that that's actually when the modern week began to take hold of our consciousness. So I'm attached to the idea that the answer to Lisa's question is no.
All right, one more question for you, David. Sherry asks, how did the same 7-day system develop in all different parts of the world before a time in which there was easy communication between all of these different places?
Well, I would say it didn't. I mean, Sherry gives the example of China. China didn't observe a 7-day week. The only people who cared about the 7-day cycle in China, really before the late 19th century, were missionaries and people that they had converted. When China, to the extent that China was not, as a society, was not in communication with parts of the world that were Christian or Muslim, they didn't have a 7-day week. But colonialism and then global capitalism have brought parts of the world into contact and that wouldn't have been in contact, and that is one way in which changes in technologies of communication have assisted the spread of the weak to places that didn't have it. It just doesn't form part of my story about 19th century America.